Consumers can increasingly purchase exactly what they want with a click, swipe, or voice command. This new standard is raising the bar for customer engagement across all industries, and the concept of a linear customer journey is now an outdated paradigm. We've evolved into omnipresent consumers. To keep pace, utility companies should elevate the human experience. One solution? Leverage the data-rich smart home or home office that offers personalized energy solutions in the moments that matter. Utilities have an opportunity to use the data from smart homes to help drive a better customer experience. How can they do so profitably? First, let's get to know prosumers, a rapidly growing customer segment living in smart homes with solar panels, batteries, and/or electric vehicles involved in a bidirectional flow of energy and data with utilities. But their actions can be taxing on the grid. To avoid grid burden and disruption, utilities can engage smart space consumers in demand-side management, or DSM. DSM can reduce energy use when demand is highest and shift consumer usage to times when cheap, renewable energy is plentiful on the grid. How can utilities use DSM to capture value in the smart home? Utilities can engage customers in smart home DSM by sharing real-time energy data. Then, they can build voice-assisted DSM capabilities to further enhance the experience. Finally, they can equip smart homes for DSM via customized product bundles sold on utility marketplaces. How can you build a smart platform to leverage the next frontier in consumer engagement?
Hello, and welcome to EEI's 2020 Leadership Summit Breakout Session on Corporate Sustainability. I'm Maria Pope, President and CEO of Portland General Electric, and I'm excited to lead this discussion today. Sustainability is an important topic for us all. Here in Oregon and at Portland General Electric, we mirror what is happening nationally. Customers increasingly expect clean energy and expect us to move quickly to decarbonize. As essential service providers, our industry is leading, especially during these unprecedented times given the pandemic, economic uncertainty, and social unrest. At Portland General Electric, we put customers at the center of all that we do. Alongside safety, reliability, and affordability, sustainability goals are our top priority. Businesses like Home Depot and Microsoft have publicly declared aggressive sustainability and carbon reduction goals. Across our industry, the electric sector has already reduced emissions 33% below 2005 levels. And EEI member companies collectively are on a path to achieve a 50% reduction by 2030, with much more aggressive goals targeted by 2050. As we know, this important work is challenging. Here with me today are two leaders to share with us their impressive insights behind their ambitious sustainability goals and pathways to achieving them. Please join me in welcoming Craig D'Arcy, Director of Energy Management at Home Depot, and Brian Janous, General Manager of Energy and Sustainability at Microsoft. Welcome. Craig has decades of experience in energy management and is responsible for leading Home Depot's efforts to reduce energy consumption and spend, as well as optimize their strategic approach to energy supply markets, alternatives, and renewable energy projects. Prior to joining Home Depot, he held roles at Ernst & Young and Arthur Andersen. Brian joined Microsoft in 2011 after a decade in the industry where he worked as a senior consultant at Brubaker and Associates, assisting Fortune 500 companies with energy procurement, policy, and sustainability. Craig, Brian, thank you and welcome. Both of you have been at the forefront of sustainability discussions with aggressive goals. At Home Depot to reduce carbon by 50% by 2035, and you have recently announced your commitment to 335 megawatts of renewable energy projects by 2025. And at Microsoft, you have achieved carbon neutrality with the goal of being carbon negative by 2030. Impressive. I'd like to kick off our discussion today to better understand these aggressive goals and your key drivers. Brian, do I start with you?
Sure. So the goals that we've laid out most recently, and it goes back to a January announcement, is, as you noted, we have announced that by 2030 we're going to be carbon negative as a company, and this is building on prior commitments that we made dating back to 2012, where we first determined to be carbon neutral. And so the evolution has been looking at what we can do immediately around things like carbon offsets and unbundled renewable energy credits, to really moving more deeply into our supply chain and thinking about, what are we doing that's really truly impactful for the planet? And this is where our carbon negative goal has come from. And so we determined to not only expand the scope to include not just our own operations, but also our entire supply chain, but also to pay back our climate debt to the founding of the company in 1975. And so the goal is by 2030, we're effectively truly carbon neutral. And then from 2030 to 2050, we're actually removing more carbon from the atmosphere than we're emitting.
Terrific. Craig, do you want to tell us about your goals at Home Depot and what you're doing?
Sure. So we, first of all, it's awesome to hear what's going on at Microsoft. Those are truly ambitious goals. So that's really, really great to hear. Listen, for us, our first time releasing goals in the sustainability space was back in 2015. Back then we released goals that were really focused around, two separate goals, one around usage and one around sourcing from an alternative and renewable energy standpoint. More recently, as we've achieved those, we've now streamlined that and as you mentioned, released a long-range goal of a 50% emissions reduction by 2035. And so we're often running towards that with a lot of efforts, again, both on the efficiency and sourcing sides to get there. In terms of what sort of animates and drives those goals and setting them, for us, it's absolutely a combination. Part of it, and back at the onset of all of this, a lot of it initially, frankly, was around a compelling case for driving immediate shareholder return. There are just a lot of projects in this space that really have a compelling financial story to tell. And so early days, we were about that. As we had success with that, it really drove interest and excitement across the company and a desire to do more. And so I'd say as we are setting these more ambitious goals, start to think about casting a different frame, and now that really being driven by commitments and desires to serve both the associates in our stores and what's important to them, and the customers shopping our stores. And we know how increasingly important this is to them. So that played a factor in us setting those goals as well.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit more about what were the key points along your journey as you got to where you are today?
Sure. So, probably first key point is our first efforts in this. We were, when one way or another, we've been at sort of, efforts to drive efficiency improvements for years and years and years. But I would say that ramped up probably in the 2013 timeframe with some lighting initiatives and some control systems changes and upgrades that we made. In terms of renewable energy projects and things like that, it was a similar time frame there. And again, in terms of kind of key points in the journey, I would say getting approval for our first offsite project was really a big one for us. And that was back in 2013, I believe. Sustainability was important back then as well. But I think the way we were initially successful was to frame it up and say, hey, we know these things are important and we care about them. But even if you want to put those soft benefits to the side, you ought to feel great about this project because it just makes a ton of economic sense. And that was a key point for us because it really got us started on this journey. Again, as we move forward from that, now we build on it. And now there's an excitement around the broader sustainability, the story to tell. And so we're working on that. But I would say those are some key points early on for us.
That's impressive. Brian, you talked about going all the way back to Microsoft's founding as you look at you being carbon negative by 2030. As you've been on this journey, can you talk about some of the key points and where you pivot as you think about corporate sustainability?
Sure. So I've been, as you mentioned earlier, I started at Microsoft in 2011, and it was in 2012 where we made our first sort of big commitment around climate. And so I've been able to sort of watch this journey all the way through. And what's been fascinating to me is what has really been the driver for us has been the degree and level of executive engagement, right? And so when we started off very early on, we had, I would just say, very moderate executive engagement on some of these commitments that we were making and some of the first steps we were taking. I think there was certainly an awareness that sustainability was important, but at the time, at least for Microsoft, we were a very different company in 2011 and 12 than we are today. So, our energy consumption, for instance, was just a mere fraction of what it is. And so I don't even think there was a sense of what we were going to become as a company at that time. But as our energy consumption has grown, as our cloud business has grown, there's become much deeper awareness of our environmental footprint and what it actually means for our business. And so what I've observed over those years is every commitment that you've seen us make or revise or get more aggressive, behind the scenes, there's some executive who's taking ownership and really starting to push harder for those of us who initially were pulling are now being pushed to go faster than we ever thought that we could go. And so the executive engagement for us has really been that pivotal point along the way to really help drive our sustainability targets.
Thank you. As a company also based in the Pacific Northwest, your leadership from your executives throughout your entire company has not only shaped what's gone on in the Pacific Northwest, but I think has also been exceptional leadership across the country. So thank you. As you look at carbon reduction versus renewable energy, how do you think of those two, and where do you focus in terms of communications in your work? Brian, do you want to take that one again, and then we can turn to Craig?
Yeah, I'll take that. So when we think about when we first started, we really were looking at just our own direct emissions and indirect emissions via energy purchasing. So that was what we call our scope 1 and scope 2. But as we've gone on, we've begun to really expand that, and so we're looking more holistically at what is the true carbon impact of our operations. And renewable energy is a big part of it for us because we're a huge consumer of energy. But when we start talking about becoming carbon negative, we're really looking at the entire supply chain and thinking about not only how do we reduce the emissions that we do control, but then how do we influence our supply chain to reduce our suppliers' emissions, and then ultimately how do we remove from the atmosphere via carbon capture via nature-based solutions, the remaining carbon that we can't squeeze out of our supply chain.
Brian, thank you. And Craig, you mentioned the impact to your P&L, positive shareholder impact, as well as associates in your stores and your customers. Can you talk more about your key audiences and how you communicate carbon reduction versus renewable energy goals?
Yeah, well, those are our key audiences for sure. I mean, when you think about the folks that are wearing aprons and working in our stores these days and the folks that are shopping our stores these days, there's no question that as those profiles change, that people care more and more about this. And so we have absolutely tried to be intentional on doing more and more to message, to a certain extent, doing more and being more active in doing these types of projects, but also doing more to message some of the things we were already doing to make sure that internally our store associates are able to see what's going on and that our customers are as well. In terms of carbon reductions versus renewable energy, I mean, for us, the way we're thinking about it is carbon reduction is the overall goal and target that we set now, and renewable energy is really one of a couple of levers that we can pull to get there, right? So the other one is efficiency, and one of the things we've tried to do across all of this over the past few years is to be really agnostic from an approach and a technology type. So if it's an efficiency project that makes a ton of sense, then we're going to do that. We're going to go roll out LED fixtures across our sales floor. If it's a renewable energy project that makes sense, we're going to do that. And whether that is on-site and installed on the roof of our store, or if it's a virtual PPA we sign with an off-site provider, we're open to all of that. I think the point is that there are a bunch of levers to pull, of which renewable projects are a huge one for sure. It's all under the umbrella of trying to drive carbon emissions reductions for us.
Great, thank you. As I mentioned, as we kick things off, the energy industry and utilities in particular have made tremendous progress already in reducing carbon and have aggressive goals as we move forward. One of the things we spent a lot of time doing is discussing how we measure and how we report. Can you speak to the type of reporting that you're doing and what's most important to you? Brian, why don't we go to you with that question, and then we'll kick it back to Craig.
Sure. So we're pretty transparent when it comes to our emissions, the sources of those emissions. We report to the CDP every year and have for a number of years. So transparency is really important to us, both our own transparency as well as the transparency of our suppliers. And so, being able to get good data on, what our utilities are supplying to us, how it's being tracked, and then of course our entire supply chain. We're actually starting to institute new supplier codes of conduct that are requiring a greater degree of transparency around carbon emissions, because if we're going to take responsibility for those emissions, we need to have clarity as to what they are, how they're being tracked, because they're then going to land on our books as an accountability that we have. So ultimately, the most important thing for us is timely and transparent data.
Great, thank you. Craig, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, first of all, I would echo the transparency statement, and frankly, that's kind of easy when you're doing the kind of things that a Microsoft is doing, or, increasingly that we're trying to do on the Home Depot side. it's kind of fun to be transparent about that because it's a good news story to tell. But same approach, we're reporting to the CDP. We get some third-party help to do that to make sure we feel like we're getting all of that data right. We received an A rating from the CDP. I should throw that in because we were really proud of it. So good data is key to all of that for sure, and helps us. And then also, I mentioned the change in approach to how we set goals, right? So the first set of goals that we put in place when it was things we directly controlled entirely, maybe it was less important because we can measure our own usage and we can measure our own alternative and renewable energy projects that we're stacking up. As we've shifted to this science-based target and trying to reduce our carbon emissions by 50%, now we certainly rely on good and valid external data as a part of that. So that's huge for us for sure.
That's great. Let me follow up with kind of a technical question. As we look at carbon reporting that we know focuses on 3 types of emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, how does your company prioritize these? And are they all have equal importance?
So for us at the Home Depot, I'll take that one first, I guess. For us, we are, for now, I would say most focused on scope 1 and scope 2. So scope 1 and scope 2 rolled up, you can consider those of equal importance and things we're trying to do. Scope 3 we know is important for sure, and is one that we want to lean into and try to bend that curve down as well. But our goals that we've set and what we are holding ourselves accountable to right now is scope 1 and 2. So you'd say those are of outsized importance to us as we get started on this journey.
Great. Well, thank you. And Brian, anything to add on that, or anything as you look at effective communications on what you're doing and trying to project your leadership? How should we look at this issue?
Yeah, so we actually look at all of those as equally important, and this was part of our recent announcement when we decided to pursue being carbon negative. We did include scope 3, our supply chain emissions, which for us are about 75% of our overall emissions. Our emissions last year were something around 17 million metric tons, of which most of that is supply chain, both upstream and downstream. And so we look at those as having equal weight. And they're all actually subject to our internal carbon tax. So we've, since 2012, have had a carbon tax that all the businesses absorb. And that goes to effectively fund the programs that we then have to roll out to achieve carbon neutrality and ultimately being carbon negative. So prior to January, we were really just looking at scope 1 and 2 as what we were taxing, but then we since expanded that to scope 3. And what we found is that when you start to bring your supply chain into it, the number of people inside the company that now have some accountability for sustainability grows exponentially. So if I go back to when it was just our direct emissions, there were realistically only a handful of us in the company that had any lever to pull for us, because most of it was electricity. So most of that was me and my team. And then we had a handful of other things. But once we pulled the supply chain into it, there's people coming out of the woodworks now thinking about the design of the Xbox and how much electricity it consumes while it's sitting idle. And then, what happens in the manufacturing and the construction of and building of those devices. And so there's so many different things that are now in scope for us that it's almost head spinning for us, to be honest. It's just so many things that we now have to think about and complexities that just weren't there before.
Well, I can appreciate that, as we obviously are a supplier to you and have a great partnership with Microsoft. What more can companies like Portland General and others across the country do to work better with Microsoft?
Well, there's probably a couple things. I mean, one, we talked about transparency already, right? And having good, visibility into roadmaps and where you're going, and how you view overall the energy transition, and how we can make it go faster. Because so many of the things that Craig and I are talking about doing in terms of renewable energy, et cetera, we're doing because our utilities are not moving fast enough. Like we have targets that are more aggressive and then are more near term than what our utilities have. And so we have to go out and sort of take responsibility for these things ourselves. So the more that we can partner with our utilities to help them go faster, that's a win for all of us. But then we also want to think about, we have, I think as Craig does too, we have our own on-site assets. We have data centers, have standby generation, we have energy storage on site. We're looking for ways to integrate those into the grid in intelligent ways so that we can make good behind the meter investment decisions that can accrue to the overall benefit of the grid operations. And so, working closely with utilities on how we can be smarter about what we're doing behind our meter is also really helpful.
That's great. That's terrific insights. Craig, anything to add? What can the industry do to work with Home Depot well?
Yeah, no, first of all, I would echo all of that. Totally agree with what Brian had to say on that. Beyond that, I mean, I know it's stating the obvious, but when you think about things like utility offered green tariffs, things like that, continuing to work to make those more economically attractive and really to try to get closer and closer to parity with what a project looks like when you go bilateral and sign a virtual PPA. That will make those easier and easier to adopt. So that one for sure on the sourcing side. And then back on the energy efficiency side, also kind of stating the obvious, but continuing to incentivize new and emerging technology that's got a role to play moving forward. I mean, that, incentive programs have played a huge role in the economic case to be made for a lot of the projects we've done over the past few years, LED fixtures most prominently for sure. So continuing to incentivize new and emerging technology will help drive adoption for sure. I think those are two big things.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's super helpful. Given the heightened focus under these pandemic conditions, economic uncertainty, and social unrest, as we think of the pace of transformation as we go forward, how should we put in perspective this unique period as we look forward? Brian, do you want to kick us off on that?
Sure. I think, historically, energy transformation has been very slow. If you look back over the history of the electricity industry, it's just been a very slow move to introduce new technologies. And realistically, you haven't had the pace of change that we're seeing today at any point in the history of this industry. And it's obviously being driven by extraordinarily low costs for new technologies that are relatively easy to integrate into the grid. If you go back to looking at the 1920s and 30s, you obviously had a lot of hydro being built, but hydro is pretty difficult. It's large scale. Nuclear in the 70s, again, very difficult, huge scale, tons of capital. Wind and solar don't really fit that same mold. They're very different, and they will force a reckoning and a transformation that is going to be far faster than what this industry has ever experienced before. And we're seeing it every day with just the pace of adoption and penetration of these technologies. So we really, I think, have to, get serious about how fast this is happening. And I saw someone made a comment the other day. I don't know that anyone's ever put out a forecast of renewable adoption that has ever been too high. They're always shockingly low. We always look back and laugh at the forecast from 4 or 5 years ago for how fast these things are starting to really integrate into the system. So I think that's where the partnership opportunity comes in to work with customers, because we all have the same goal, or certainly many of the corporates in the United States have the same goal, which is let's decarbonize as fast as possible. And so I think we, as an industry, really need to get serious about, what does that mean, and how can we start setting realistic forecasts and goals and targets for how fast we can move to a decarbonized electric grid.
That's really helpful. Craig, anything you want to add as we are looking to the future and the advice you have? I think particularly commenting on Brian's comments with regards to the pace of change.
Yeah, I think those are spot on. And from a customer standpoint, what I think is worth calling out is that there are two dynamics there that can potentially be a little bit in conflict that as a customer you have to keep in mind. So one is the speed at which this pace of change is accelerating, which Brian talked about, and I think that is for sure a fact. And that's a little bit at odds with how long it takes to get your arms around and to deploy some of these solutions from a customer standpoint. And so I guess my advice would be for customers who are a little earlier in the journey, I think now is the right time to really be all about trying to figure it out and roll these projects out, because the pace of change is picking up. The pace of what's demanded from us as businesses is picking up. And not all of these are quick and easy to roll out and implement. So I think the time is right now for folks to to start the journey if they haven't, to try to figure out how to proactively embrace these solutions. Again, whether it be on the efficiency side or on the renewable sourcing side. The time is now based on these factors.
Craig, thank you. And let's build a little bit upon that. You both are exceptional leaders in this area, exceptional leaders within your organizations. For those just starting out on sustainability, where should they put their efforts first, and what advice do you have for them?
Yeah, so I guess I'll take that first. I mean, I would say, maybe I'm just speaking from experience, but I think the best way to have some success is to go tackle some projects that have very compelling economic returns and ought to be very easy to sell internally from a leadership standpoint, right? So when you think about energy management control systems on the efficiency side, LED fixtures on the efficiency side, there are some projects out there that truly are low-hanging fruit in most cases and are going to have an incredibly compelling ROI, payback period, however you want to measure it. So I would say start at the place where you can get a quick foothold and build some credibility to then grow from there and to continue talking to folks about sustainability projects that are a little more, ambitious and look a little different.
Great. Brian, anything to add on where you would suggest that companies start if this is a new area for them?
Certainly, yeah. I would add. I mean, the first thing is to really just deeply understand, what are your key issues as a company as it relates to sustainability and climate, and find peer companies that are further down the road than you are. I mean, obviously, my issues, in sort of cloud is very different than Craig's in the retail space. So, as I compare notes with peers across different industries, I'm always fascinated by the nature and the layer of their problems and their complexity and how different they are from my own. We're all trying to solve the same thing, which is to decarbonize our operations, but we all have different levers to pull. And so it's helpful to understand, where do you sort of fit in that? Where are sort of the corollary industries to you? And take a look around and see, who's leading in that space and who's made a lot of progress. And I've found it to be an incredibly collaborative area across different industries. I get calls all the time from different companies that just want to talk a little bit about, hey, we're thinking about starting out on this. We've seen some of the stuff that you've done. Can you explain this a little more? And so I'm always happy to take those calls because I feel like it's good for the industry overall if we can share those learnings more broadly.
Great.
Hey,
well,
I was going to follow up on that, and Brian used the exact word I was going to say. I mean, it's such a good point in terms of leveraging a network of peers that's out there, and collaborative was the word I was going to reference. It really is a collaborative sector in space, and there's no reason to sit in a bubble and to try to figure this stuff out in isolation, because a lot of it is somewhat daunting in terms of how to sort of measure these projects, how to think about the legal and contract components of some of these projects. And there are absolutely folks out there that are willing to share, and maybe at a different point on the journey. And that applies to all of us. I mean, we've done a number of things that we're really proud of. I'm asking people questions all the time. There are always folks out there that have experience to share, and for the most part, people are willing to share it.
Thank you. It's great advice for all of us. And as the utility industry, one of the things that's a hallmark of what we do is not just collaboration, but also mutual assistance and cooperation. And we look forward to partnering with each of your companies, but with all of our customers, large and small, as we accelerate the pace of change and move forward to a decarbonized economy. Before we take questions, we just have some sort of closing comments and some advice that would be helpful to all of us that we haven't covered. Craig, let's start with you, and then we'll conclude with Brian.
Yeah, no, first of all, listen, thanks for talking through these questions. I think it's been a great conversation. Great to hear what Brian and Microsoft are up to as well. It's really inspiring, both in terms of the goals and the projects that they're doing to get there. That's awesome. No, I mean, the advice, I would just echo some of the things I said already, which there are ways to get started on this journey if you haven't already, in terms of leveraging peers and targeting projects initially that have really compelling financial stories to tell. So I think that's a big part of it. And the other is what we talked about in terms of the pace, and the fact that the pace of change is speeding up and the pace of what's expected from us is speeding up. I think we've all got to embrace that and use it as an opportunity to move more quickly on our side.
Great, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I would add just don't be afraid to set aggressive targets for which you don't have a very clear roadmap on how you're going to get there. I think we've sort of entered a stage now where you're in good company if you're setting aggressive climate targets. Investors will respond well, your customers will respond well, and there are a lot of unknowns. There are a lot of uncertainties about how we're going to get there. But again, the pace of change is maddeningly fast right now, and so there's so much that we can accomplish in the next 10 years that I would just say feel free to reach out and set some moonshot targets and see where they can take you.
Well, I love the term moonshot, and I will also say that there's no question that all of us have learned in this past period of time to live with additional ambiguity, uncertainty, and to focus on significant targets and moonshots. Thank you both for your leadership. We admire all that you are doing to transform. And with that, let's take some questions.